Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining our webinar today. I'm excited to have Dave Riggs, Neil Spingarn, Val Wheeler here with me today hosting the webinar. I'm Katie Breinig, and I will be moderating today's session. Before we begin, I will let you know a little bit how this webinar will run. Today's webinar is being recorded, and the slides and the recording will be available for you within 3 business days. A short Q&A session will follow the presentation to answer viewer-submitted questions. During the webinar, you can submit questions you have using the webinar sidebar menu. Select the Questions tab, type in your questions, then hit the Enter key on your keyboard. Remember, you can submit questions throughout the webinar. That concludes my brief introduction today. Dave, I will now pass the webinar off to you. You may begin your presentation.
All right, Caitlin, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. So today, I, along with my esteemed Eurofins scientific colleagues, are going to talk about really 5 different aspects of foreign materials and ingredients, dietary supplements, beverages, OTC products. We're going to break it down into 5 sections. First, we're going to give you just an overview of the approach. There are a number of quality, brand, and regulatory considerations I think that our webinar participants will be interested in. Then we'll really get into the meat and potatoes of the presentation, which is really background on the actual analytical techniques, the instruments, how they work, what they're useful for, how to put them all together to solve problems. Then there are some considerations you need to think about if you do decide to engage with an external testing partner or outside laboratory. And then finally, usually the thing most people like, we actually have 9 actual case studies where we've changed some of the details to protect confidentiality, but we're going to put the analytical tools, techniques, instruments to use, and we're actually going to solve 9 real problems that have happened in our industry that really illustrate how you can put these tools and techniques together, hopefully to solve problems for your company or your particular situation. So again, I'm Dave Riggs. I'm a 37-year industry veteran with both manufacturing experience and testing labs. I've been in the fee-for-services testing lab business for the last 15 years. My colleague to my right, Dr. Neil Spingarn, with over 40 years experience in all aspects of testing, inspection, certification, running his labs. He's an expert on all the techniques we're showing today. He's been an expert witness in over 500 legal insurance cases. And then we've got Val Wheeler. She's got over 20 years of experience in the laboratory space, method development, forensic work. So it's really a privilege and honor to have these 3 esteemed colleagues joining me on the presentation today. Just a little bit about Eurofins. We have 2 laboratories. So we have one lab in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, another in Santa Ana, California. Most of the instruments and techniques are available at both laboratories. So we're able to kind of offer 2-point source of supply to handle the big projects, the small projects. Combined, there's over 40 scientists, 3 PhDs. It's actually closer to $8 million of state-of-the-art instruments. And really, our DNA is problem solving and investigative based analytical work. Kind of our nickname is we're the MacGyver labs, if people remember the MacGyver television program. We've done thousands of successful investigations, and we like to tell people we're the lab to call when you don't know who to call. We're also very proud to be part of the greater Eurofins network of ISO 17025 laboratories. So we have over 55,000 employees in our network, over 900 laboratories. We're in 59 countries, and we boast over 200,000 different in our portfolio. So all we have to do is go to our Rolodex, and we probably have a method that we could adapt to your particular situation. So I want to take a break here from the scientific stuff and just give everyone fair warning. We're going to have a raffle at the end of the webinar. So any person who stays on through the Q&A session you will be, your name is basically put in a hat, and our marketing folks will select those, and we'll mail out five $25 gift cards at the end of this. They may contact you for a mailing information. In some cases, we can send out e-cards. So just wanted to, one more reason to kind of pay attention. So now we get into, why is it important to identify risk, whether that's in your supply chain, your product, your manufacturing process. So just up and down everything, really from, I say from the field, to the fork. So risk is unavoidable. It's ever evolving. With pandemics, climate change, regulatory updates, disruptions in supply chains, labor shortages, really all of those equate to higher risk, probably for every aspect of your business. So to really get started identifying risk, it's really pretty simple. Look upstream first. What are your ingredients? What are your suppliers? What are your supply chains, your packaging, your process days? That's number one. Then think about, well, who are my manufacturing partners, my co-packers, my process for manufacturing? Are we going from a manual process to an automated process? Do we put new kind of heating elements in our oven? What kind of cleaning products? And then obviously downstream, which might be your warehousing, your distribution, the trucking companies, different retailers. A lot of people touch products. And then break it down into three types. There's either going to be physical risks, chemical risks, or biological. Probably a recipe for not good sales, not good growth, and increased risk, and that's not what we want to do. So being proactive, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of the curve. So first of all, it's a requirement of Food Safety Modernization Act if you're in the dietary supplements, OTC, pharma, or the excipient space. There are other regulations if you participate in maybe global marketplace, if you export to Canada, to Europe, whatnot. But really, you want to increase your quality and your product performance, gain control of your supply chain, everything from your labels to your market share, improves your bottom line. So, we usually ask for a show of hands. Who's not for improving your quality? Who's not for reducing risk? Who's not for improving your bottom line? And you don't usually get too many people saying no. So it's critical to bolster your product brand stewardship. And as everyone knows, one negative publicity event can destroy an entire company. And if you can identify problems quickly, if you can prevent the incident from impacting production or getting into your downstream supply chain or marketplace, again, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, and you never want to be live at 5. But the real reason to do it, just as good product stewards, as people working in the food, beverage, ingredient place, it's the right thing for all of us to do as good stewards. So in terms of what are the things that can happen, obviously food fraud and adulteration, whether that's unknown materials, undeclared allergens, colorants, drugs, other ingredients, that's a bad one. Packaging failures can lead to spoilage, loss of product, delay in delivery, product rejections, recalls, quarantines. Obviously, we don't want any harm to end users or consumers. Negative publicity, I'll probably say that 3 or 4 times, but I've seen it destroy companies literally in just a matter of days or weeks. Damage to your brand or reputation, which is difficult to get back, especially in the day and age of social media. And in many cases, legal action or insurance claims. So we don't want that to happen. Of course, headaches for all of us who have to deal with it in the middle. So in terms of what to do next, I always say just really keep it simple. Figure out where to reduce risk, look it up and down your supply chain, and write down anything you can do preventively to kind of, keep the train on the track, if you will. So start with verifying your suppliers. That's the #1 thing. And just identify risk and control points up and down your supply chain that lend themselves to inspection, monitoring, any type of proactive metrics. So here's our first poll question. So Caitlin, I'm going to let you tell me when to put the answer up. But
Yep.
according to multiple industry sources, what was the #1 consumer complaint in food and beverages in 2021? You've got 3 options, A, B, and C.
All right, we'll give everyone about 45 seconds here, and then I'm going to close the poll for you guys, and Dave's going to go ahead and reveal the answer for you guys and explain a little bit about it. All right, about 10 more seconds here, everyone.
While we're doing that, we'll have our next presenter get their camera up since we've had a little lag. All right, that sounds like 10, and the answer is it's foreign bodies. That's the large single cause of consumer complaints based by industry sources for food, drink manufacturers, retailers, and enforcement authorities, which includes FDA, USDA, and we also included Health Canada because we do a lot of business with our friends north of the border. So with that, I'm going to hand things off to Val Weiler. And Val, just tell me if I need to advance to your next slide if I'm not going fast enough.
Okay, you can kind of split through this one as there's some animation kind of. So now that you know that you need to test, the next thing I want to give you is a little bit of background on where some of the foreign materials in your product could be coming from. One source is packaging. This could be from packaging incompatibility, where the product is being stored in a package that is not efficient for that storage. One example of this is a product that is too acidic being stored in aluminum cans, and that's breaking down the coating. Another source of this could be ink migrating from labeling that's on the packaging itself. Aside from packaging incompatibility, could be leaching. So the packaging is causing a component to leach into the product itself. One example of this that we're all familiar with is BPA. Another source could be product degradation. This could be common source of this is an insufficient storage. So it's being stored in a clear container and it's light sensitive, or it's just heat sensitive and sitting on a container ship for far too long. One other source of product degradation is insufficient preservatives or antioxidants. This can be due to incomplete a storage issue as well. One other thing that I want to throw out there is it could be that your packaging is not being cleaned efficiently. And so some of the materials left over from the manufacturer of the packaging has not been cleaned sufficiently out of the package before the product went in. One interesting one that we have seen in the course of our work is that the foreign material actually got entered into the product by the consumer, not due to packaging. An example of this that we've highlighted is consumer-caused backwash of food into a medicine bottle that later was identified as a foreign material, but it was caused to be there by the consumer, not the manufacturer. Next slide. Sources of contamination can be broken down into 2 categories, chemical and microbial. For chemical, these can be storage issues, could be leaching as we discussed, could be from the way it's being stored in a holding tank or from the packaging. Could be to insufficient cleaning. So either the manufacturing line or the packaging is not being cleaned properly, or the cleaning material itself could be the contaminant. Another one to add in is user error. We've identified issues where an excess amount of lubricant has been added to the manufacturing line, and that lubricant then contaminated the product. On the other side is microbial. One factor in that is improper storage. For example, the product is being stored too long at room temperature. Could be improper handling or cross-contamination, either from other things on the product line or from a person working on the product line. And the last one here is going to be a processing failure. So this would be an example, incomplete pasteurization of the product. Next slide. Another source I'd like to highlight is production issues. There can be several reasons for production issues. One is equipment failure. For example, the oven fails to reach the temperature. And so you're going to see this downstream as spoilage or microbial growth. Could be a process failure, as in the incomplete pasteurization that I talked about in the last slide. Could be user error. Equipment was out of calibration. Someone didn't notice it, used it anyway. An example that this could cause would be the incorrect amount of ingredient being added to the product, or it could just be an ingredient issue itself. As we have seen over the last year plus with supply chain issues, sometimes the ingredients that we're kind of being forced to use, getting from a new co-packer, maybe a new supplier, aren't the same quality of ingredients we once were able to use. So in all cases, foreign material contamination can be caused by a single source, or it could be caused by multiple sources. Next slide. And now I'm going to hand it off to Dr. Neil Spingarn, and he's going to start discussing some of the analytical techniques used to identify the foreign materials.
One of the key things in identifying any kind of foreign material is to use multiple techniques rather than rely on just one. Any one technique is only going to give you part of the answer. So when we attack identification of foreign materials, we do it using a variety of techniques, customizing it to the specific problem that's facing us. One of the things we always start with, though, is good imaging. And these are some pictures that help us figure out what we're going to do next. For example, when we look at a residue that contains crystalline material, when we look at it under a microscope, we can often tell whether it looks like one material or whether there are multiple types of crystals. If there are multiple types of crystals, there are probably multiple things being present, and that suggests we could have multiple sources, and we need to analyze each of them separately, not combine them all into one mixed analysis. For biologicals, the good images are very important and can be as important as chemical data. The little guy in the upper right-hand corner, to the naked eye, just looked like a little black dot. It was only when we put it under high magnification that we found our pet Fred, who got into a product error. But even with more traditional things, little other black particles that can be metallic, they can be organic or inorganic. Knowing what they look like can often give us a clue to where they could come from. And even something like a piece of glass. Knowing it's glass tells you one thing, but looking at the morphology of the glass, what kind of cleavage planes does it have? Is it smooth or rough? Gives us clues to what kind of glass it could be and how it got there. So a good image is really key to knowing what to do next and to help find the source of the problems. Next slide. We're going to talk about some of the other techniques we use. We have, just in our lab, about 20 different analytical techniques that we use in foreign material identifications. We're only going to talk about a couple of them here, but these are some of the more common ones. We talked about imaging using light, which is what the images are before. We can also use an electron microscope to get images. And the advantage of that is we get much higher resolution and much higher magnification. The second advantage is that SEM, or scanning electron microscopy, is generally coupled with energy dispersive X-ray analysis, or EDX. And that gives us the ability to get elemental information on anything we can see in the SEM. We can do that at any given point of what we're looking at, or we can scan an area, or we can even map out the elemental distribution over an area. And that helps us know what's located in the defect area, what's located in the non-defect area. And by distinguishing the two of them, we get at least elemental information. This is very important, not just for foreign materials, but also to identify corrosion spots, see if there's changes in the surface morphology, things like pinholes and other defects in packaging. If there are multiple layers, we can look at them sometimes by cross-section and other ways to see whether something is going on there. And this can be done not only qualitatively, but in a semi-quantitative way that looks for very subtle differences between two areas or two parts of the same material. Again, this gives us elemental information. The next slide, we start talking about not just what elements are present, but spectroscopy is being used to figure out how those elements are put together. There are many different ways to do that, and this slide just illustrates a couple of them. The first that is probably most familiar to people is infrared analysis, or FTIR. This can be done on bulk materials where there are lots of residue or lots of material, but also with coupled to a microscope, we call it micro FTIR, allows us to look at even a single crystal or particle and get a good quality infrared spectrum. Infrared analysis can be used for not just organic materials, but it can also give us information on many types of inorganic materials. The three panels running across the top are from one study where there were different parts of the residue. We could fish out little bits of solid material. These showed up as protein, which we can attribute to the pork product that it was based on. This was in a brine, so we expect salt. We get a spectrum consistent with that. And there were other areas that showed carbonate. And so we can separate some of the different materials by looking at what appear to be different things. Looking at them with micro FTIR, we can identify different components. But many things are not amenable to IR for a variety of reasons. Something absorbs too weakly to show up in an IR spectrum, or there are technical problems in being able to obtain the spectrum. And Raman analysis is another way of looking at the same type of information, how elements are bonded to each other. When we know how elements are put together, connected to each other, we can then make a picture out of the puzzle of these different pieces. Raman has a few advantages over infrared. First of all, it can detect some types of bonds that are weakly detected in infrared. The second is we don't get interferences from certain things that are a real problem in infrared. You would never be able to get an infrared spectrum of a solution of a material that's dissolved in water. And because water is a very, very strong absorber in the infrared region. However, with Raman, water is completely invisible. And the bottom panel shows a comparison of a spectrum of this is citric acid. The lower trace shows solid citric acid, and the upper trace shows a solution of citric acid. You say, well, it's the same thing. Why should it look different? But it's not actually the same thing. In the crystal, in the solid material, citric acid is interacting only with itself. And so there are one set of bonds in the citric acid within the molecule and on between molecules. But in solution, the citric acid is mostly surrounded by water molecules. So now we have different types of interactions as well as the structure of the citric acid, and we can see the results of both of those types of interactions. The ability to see through clear things allows Raman to get analysis through a glass bottle. We can look at the contents of a bottle by running the beam through it. Same thing with a plastic bag. And so in field analysis for drugs, this is now a very common technique. We'll have a portable Raman spectrometer. An officer or somebody out in the field, even in the factory, can simply put one of these devices next to a plastic bag containing whatever the unknown material is and get a spectrum of that material through the bag without even opening it. Very powerful for quality control, but also very useful in the laboratory for giving us another way to get information about how molecules are put together. There are many other types of spectroscopy that we use in foreign material identification, but those are subject for another lecture. The next slide, please. In addition to the chemical properties that we've talked about in the last couple of slides, we also look at the physical properties of a material. And particularly we find useful looking at the properties as a function of temperature. One such device is called thermogravimetric analysis, or TGA. This looks at the weight of a material and how it changes as we heat it. So if something starts out at 100% of its weight, as we heat it, it loses weight for a variety of reasons. Some of those reasons can be moisture content, so the water evaporates out of the sample. Materials can decompose, and we can get the amount of material that decomposed from this analysis. We can look at the amount of residue that remains after we've decomposed the bulk material, so inorganic fillers and things like that would show up. This type of analysis is extremely useful for polymers and rubbers. For example, if you've got a piece of a gasket that somehow got into your product, knowing that it's a gasket or a piece of rubber is one useful bit of information, but you probably want to know which gasket is breaking down. And in your production line, there are likely to be many different types of gaskets. By comparing them, they're each going to have slightly different compositions. The elastomers could be different, but they could just differ in the amount of carbon black or the amount of inorganic filler. And a technique like TGA allows us, even on a microscopic sample, to be able to compare it to reference standards and help you figure out which is the source of the rubber, not just tell you that it's rubber. There are many other types of physical tests. Another common one that we're not showing a slide for is differential scanning calorimetry, or DSC. This one, which also works alongside TGA, gives us information like melting points, freezing points, and also monitors the energy required to freeze a material or to boil a material. So if you need to use energy to heat up a sample, or you need to use energy to cool a sample, we can measure the amount of energy you need to do that, and that helps with designing or working on production lines. Also looking at percent of cure. Many things fail because an adhesive wasn't cured properly, and so it's separated. We can look at the percent of cure using a technique like DSC. For some other techniques, I'll pass on to Val for some more.
Another analysis that we use is inductively coupled plasma, or ICP for short. And this uses a plasma torch in order to excite the electrons of an element, and then we can measure the optical emission spectrum generated by the electrons returning to their non-energized state. So for ICP, some options that you want to look at is could be nutritional minerals, calcium, magnesium, potassium, selenium. These are elements that are commonly added to food products. Perhaps the amount that is being added is not what the specifications required and are thus causing conglomerates. Another thing that we can be used to look using ICP is metals, including the heavy metals, arsenic, cadmium, mercury, lead. This would be a sign that something is perhaps breaking off in the manufacturing products. It could also be a contaminant from one of the raw materials. Detectors that we use with ICP could either be OES, so the optical emission spectrum that's formed from the plasma torch, or it could be mass spec, where we're using the mass to charge ratio of the element to identify it. The difference between the two, you're going to be able to get a lot lower detection limits using mass spec, but both of them are going to give you valuable information about the foreign material. Next slide. Another valuable technique is chromatography. So we utilize both liquid chromatography and gas chromatography in our analyses. These are great for things that are kind of dissolved or within the product. So for liquid chromatography, we're going to look at the non-volatile components, such as organic acids, dyes, sugars. The spectrum you can see on the right, these are dyes that were found in a purple drink. So the larger red peak that you see is red 40, and then the smaller peak just Just next to it is blue warm. We're able to use those and compare back to a reference source if needed to identify the source of the form material. Or it could be evidence that something else has been added if there are additional dyes that should not be in the product. The other chromatography method is gas chromatography, and this is going to be used for volatile components. A very common one is solvents. This could be residual from the manufacturing process, could be residual from an extraction procedure that didn't go to completion. And so there is residual solvent left in the product itself. This can also be used for off-odor and off-flavor analyses to help identify the foreign material. As you can see below, the spectrum that you're seeing is different volatile components in coffee. And why that is so nice is because those flavor and those aromas components are often very volatile. And now I'm going to hand it back to my colleague to discuss some additional techniques.
All right, thank you, Val, for the overview of the analytical techniques. So now we talk about microbial screening, including DNA analysis. It's useful to identify and quantify different microorganisms, yeast, mold, bacteria. Many of these are pathogenic, which you're familiar with, E. coli, salmonella, staph. But also, it's possible to do custom culturing followed by metagenomic 16S long sequencing. And then we can identify which specific microorganism it is. Oftentimes, we can then pinpoint where in the process the contamination came from. Was it a raw material? Maybe it's in a water source. Maybe it's ineffective cleaning or sanitation. And corrective action can be taken to gain control of the process. Furthermore, this DNA testing can be more targeted for certain biological specimens and ingredients, beverages, finished products, and will be used in conjunction with, physical, chemical, thermographic techniques to really solve the problem. As an example, to perform custom culturing on an ingredient, you're probably going to need to run 3 or 4 different media types because some microorganisms are aerobic, some are anaerobic, some like high water, some like low water. There's xenophilic, xerophilic compounds, osmophilic compounds. And so microorganisms are very sensitive about where they like to thrive. So troubleshooting should be by an array of methods. And they take time, to grow and incubate. So oftentimes 24 to 72 hours is required at different conditions. But once we have those, we'll photograph and image the dominant colony forming units, as Dr. Neil Spingarn indicated. In many cases, just looking at the morphology of the microorganism under different lights or with different dyes or backgrounds, we're able to determine the microbial species. But then in other cases, we have to go with the full long sequencing. And there's an example of that shown on the bottom where the different DNA and RNA artifacts are broken into pieces and parts, compared to a database, and then we get a match. Based upon that, our scientists will look and see, okay, is this microorganism something that comes from soil? Is it something airborne? Is it something that's prevalent in water? And what types of, can it be killed by heat or using chlorine or parasitic acid? And then we can help to design a cleaning or sanitation or prevention plan for you. Finally, from times we will use ELISA or ICT assays. ELISA tends to be, there's really 4 forms, whether there's sandwiched or non-sandwiched. Some different platforms, whether we do lateral flow or more quantitative methods, but they all kind of work the same. They're useful for different types of toxins or pathogens in human blood. They tend to work on protein or protein artifacts or enzymes, so hemoglobin, allergens, antigens. They're very useful for like protease characterizations in a lot of commercial thickeners. So I show ketchup in the center image. They're also useful for determining, okay, gee, we know we have a blood spot. Well, is it human blood? There's animal blood. There's different guidelines for both of those. Guar and xanthan gums, a lot of those are added to products, again, typically for viscosity control or thickening agents. And when they're not added the right way or something goes wrong in the processing, instead of a nice, creamy, smooth, gravy or thickener or mayonnaise or salad dressing or, ketchup or something, we end up with something that's got 3 distinct layers that comes apart and, is aesthetically displeasing, and also something a consumer doesn't want to use. So there can be, large vendor quality legal claims. So ELISA kits are very, very useful for all aspects of forensic insurance and legal work. So we're down to our next poll question. So since January of 2019, allegations of food, beverage, and ingredient adulteration in U.S. Have increased on average 15% a year, 15 to 25% a year, or more than 25% per year. So
All right, if everyone could take some time to answer this question, I'll give you guys another 45 seconds to go through this, and then I'll bring it back to Dave and he'll explain the answer. All right, about 10 more seconds here. All right, and I will go ahead and close the poll. Dave, it looks like we've got about 5% respondents saying less than 15% of the year, about 60 saying 15 to 25% per year, and about 35% saying more than 25% per year. All right, I'll bring it back to you.
That's very interesting. Hold on here while our animation stuff. The answer is C. It's more than 25% a year. So there's been a cumulative annual growth rate of 32% from 2019 to 2022. And there's 2 common adulterations, typically in import material. But vegetable oil adulteration claims are up over 100%, and honey adulteration claims are up over 500% in the last 2 years. So the bees probably would have had it, but I like to say, bees make honey, and there's a lot of honey adulteration claims. So that puts the C's over the top and kind of skewed it with those 2 sectors. But unfortunately, there's a lot of unscrupulous operators all over the world. And it's been more difficult for auditors to travel overseas to really inspect a lot of the source farms and processing. So unfortunately, some nefarious characters have kind of taken a catch me if you can attitude. So really all of us need to be on guard. And Ronald Reagan used to say, it's okay to trust, but it's very important to verify. So I encourage you to audit, take a hard look at your C of A's, and do appropriate testing on your raw materials, incoming packaging, just to ensure that what you're buying and what you're paying for is really what you're getting. In terms of testing lab requirements, I'm going to try to move through this pretty quickly, but just some general things. A lot of times companies will have a large central laboratory. I worked for Dow Chemical, I worked for Mitsui Labs. We had a large central lab. We could take samples to them, anything we couldn't do in our in-house production labs. Our central lab could do it for us, and they were great. But many companies have been phasing those out. And so over the next 5 years, you may have to find a local lab partner, which could be a university, could be a regional lab, or could be somebody that specializes. So I'm just going to give some general lab considerations, and these work fine for Eurofins. They also work fine if you're working with our competitors. So we want to give our attendees today useful information for finding the right partner for your circumstances. So basically, labs are split up into 2 types, either routine testing lab or non-routine. So routine testing labs, they're going to focus on certain types of testing: food, pharmaceutical, environmental. Maybe they do microbiology testing, maybe physical testing, maybe chemical testing, things of that nature. They tend to be experienced in certain testing, certain markets. They tend to have a high throughput focus, so volume and fast turnaround time is key. Now, on the other side of the equation, you've got non-routine testing labs. They tend to be much more specialized. They focus on maybe solving obscure or non-routine and very complex and challenging problems. Their staff are oftentimes going to have a higher percentage of people with advanced degrees, like a master's degree, a doctor's degree, or maybe more industry experience, because it's more of a artisan type thing where you build up knowledge and know-how over tens, if not hundreds of years collectively. They tend to be experienced problem solvers, and it's very important that the clients have direct access to technically credible scientists so that none of the subtle details are lost in translation to truly solve the problem, get to the contributing factors, and get to the root cause. So again, routine testing labs or non-routine testing labs. Next, you want to think about, well, okay, is the lab, are they ethical? They have no conflict of interest. There's a lot of companies, and maybe they're a food manufacturer, an ingredient manufacturer, and they do have a technically independent lab that tests ingredients and products, but you just kind of always wonder, since they're owned by a parent company that's primarily a food and beverage or ingredient manufacturer, how independent, are they really? So you really want to satisfy yourself. You should always ask for references. If you're doing anything involved insurance or legal work, it's very important to have attorney-client privilege, all the right types of administrative controls. Very important from the time a sample comes to the lab to a report or certificate of analysis goes out the door. What kind of chain of custodies are they written? Are they electronic? Are they documented? Are samples stored in a locked, secure area? Are there, passcodes? Are there security systems? Are there monitoring systems? How do I know that my samples aren't commingled with my competitor samples? How do I know that, there was no funny business from the time a sample was received or people tamper with emphasis? So all those things, you should ask questions. Ensure that your partner has those in place. A lot of times the most important thing is, hey, do you have a courier network who can drive, 3 hours into the sticks and, pick up my samples on, Tuesdays and Thursdays, because I don't want to rely on FedEx or UPS, or I don't want to have to put, one of my people into a vehicle and drive them all the way. And again, many of the larger and more reputable laboratory networks do have very robust, dedicated courier services that can pick up samples same day. In many cases, they'll go 5 to 6 hours out from their lab, and they're able to provide coverage all over the continental United States and North America. You always want to ask about capabilities, quality certifications. Those are things like ISO 17025, USDA licenses. Are you registered with the Food and Drug Administration? Are you compliant with 21 CFR Part 111 for dietary supplements, Part 210, Part 211 for pharmaceuticals, medical devices, OTC compounds? Other types of accreditations. Can you handle biohazard class 1 or 2 substances? Can you bring in plants, seeds, tissues, blood, plasma, serum? Because oftentimes we're talking about food, beverages, ingredients, excipients, dietary supplements. Unfortunately, the problem is maybe a pathogen or a meat or tissue, and those are often regulated and cannot be shipped across country lines. So just a little bragging point, our family of labs can basically handle anything that's not biohazard class 3 or 4 is not a weapon of mass destruction. We actually work with all the major shipping partners, Purolator out of Canada, of course DHL, FedEx, UPS for North America, Europe, and Asia. And we can show you how to safely package, pretty much any type of sample that's not a weapon of mass destruction to get it to the lab so when we can perform investigations. You should always ask about turnaround time, capacity. A lot of times, you know, if it's a recall or quarantine situation, you know, the clock is ticking and there could be hundreds of thousands of dollars on the line if a plant is shut down or if product can't get to the shelf in terms of missed sales or missed production. And so you want to make sure you have a partner that can move quickly and, you know, put a lot of resources to hit, you know, turnaround times that could be measured in hours or days. And just to have the capacity, the instrumentation, the experience, the confidence to really be able to deliver for what you need. So I always tell people, ask specific targeted questions, and you should feel comfortable with whoever you work with, really like they're an extension of your company's R&D, quality, tech service, manufacturing support, engineering maintenance. And so not just you, but get other stakeholders in your company, interview these folks, and then select someone that you think is the right fit for you. And there's no one size, there's no one checklist, no one size fits all. Oh, excuse me. Oh, I skipped ahead. Then finally, in terms of what's the deliverable, what is the result? You know, is it just, you know, data on a certificate of analysis is a number? I like to tell people it's kind of a dime a dozen. Anyone can give you a number on a sheet. But when you actually get data and you get pictures and you get spectra, you get chromatograms, and you get thermograms, and then kind of all the backstory, and you put it all together with interpretation, now that's powerful. That's greater than the sum of the parts. When you get access to scientists during the project investigative phase, and as you're going and you're discovering, you're seeing things that weren't expected, and then when we have our data collected and we're collaborating, all the scientists together can oftentimes solve the problem that no single person can, because the right questions are being asked and we're getting collaboration. Oftentimes that's the case of, you know, 1 + 1 + 1 doesn't equal 3, it equal 5 or 7 or maybe 17, because all the people collaborating on the investigation bring something different, and we're able to kind of complete, you know, the 6M or fishbone chart to get to the true root cause, preventive and corrective actions, which is ultimately what I want. And then finally, in cases where something maybe goes to court, there's a vendor claim, a legal claim, insurance claim, will your lab stand behind their findings and sign an affidavit? Will they give a deposition? Are they willing to come to court and testify and write a report that's going to stand up to what's called the Daubert challenge, which is a legal and scientific standard that, you know, basically says it's not just hearsay, but that it's backed up by sound science and stands up to scientific peer review. And if you go down and ask all those things, you'll find that, you know, the 10,000 plus mom and pop labs around there, there's only a handful of labs that are able to do all of those things. So now we're going to get to usually what people find to be the most interesting part of our webinar, and that is where we have our case studies. So I'm going to go pretty quickly because we're running a little bit behind here. But our first one is gas formation in a bottled juice. So we had a hot pad juice product. It's getting cloudy. Gas is forming, bloating. Pretty straightforward. We cultured it, incubated it, did gene sequence-based ID, and there was a fungal, you know, bacterial, or excuse me, microbial contamination, which we identified by 16S speciation. Case study 2, we had someone, they went through a drive-through at a fast food chain. Little Johnny, little Susie bites into their hamburger or chicken sandwich. They claim, you know, they got half a rodent tail. They walk in screaming and hollering. There's witnesses. You know, I mean, there's things that are on videotape. We don't know if there was adulteration or they stripped the bun top. That's not really our job. Our job was to determine, A, was it a rodent artifact, and B, this fast food manufacturer sourced buns from 3 different companies. How do you tell hamburger bun A from B from C? We did a combination microscopy, chemical analysis, both with HPLC, protein starch characterization. Really, the organic acid profiles told the difference. You can see the chromatographs up above illustrate differences in the organic acid profiles, also the morphology in terms of the little nooks and crannies in the buns. So we were able to determine that the bun was not from one of the 3 suppliers. So, you know, a nefarious person had swapped a bun quickly when they were off camera, had someone bite in and made a big scene, but they were able to avoid bad publicity and also not have to pay an expensive insurance claim. All right, so on the next slide, this will be Neil.
Next slide is a pretty common situation of dark particles showing up somewhere where it doesn't belong. In all cases, our first step, as I talked about before, is to isolate it and take pictures. So we see some pictures of this little dark particle, but the pictures don't actually tell us very much because of too low magnification, they don't give us enough detail. So the third inset, the black and white picture in there, is now in an electron microscope. Now we get a better idea of the size and shape of it. And you might just by looking at it say, oh, well, that looks pretty like a little metallic flake. But when we get the elemental analysis on that particular flake, it turned out to be mostly carbon with some oxygen and trace metals. Now, in this particular case, the client had suspected that they might be getting his filter media, the further water system, breaking through into the product. We could compare the elemental composition of their filter media to the particle that was found. They matched. We didn't have to do very much beyond that in this particular case. But if they didn't have that subject, match material, we could have done something like Raman analysis and confirmed whether it was a graphitic carbon that may have come from a lubricant on a machine, or whether it was amorphous carbon, which is consistent with a filter media or charcoal or something burnt. So between the techniques that we used and the techniques that we could have used, whether we had the match, which we did in this case, or there was something where it was complete unknown, we can get lots of information on this type of very common problem with foreign materials. The next slide shows, this is now for a dietary supplement. This is a discolored tablet. Again, this is a pressed tablet, so it should be nice and uniform, except that it's got little spots of discoloration. We broke open the tablet. We see that the discolorations are both internal as well as on the exterior surface. And we looked at the size and distribution of them. We noted the random sizes, random distribution, no obvious pattern to what was going on. We can isolate a few of these tiny spots. We analyze them by infrared analysis. All we see is a mixture of materials, which the tablet is a mixture of materials, and the difference between the dark and the lighter areas didn't show enough differences to give us anything conclusive. But when we put the same materials in the electron microscope and look at the elemental composition, what we found is widely different levels of titanium between the two areas. Now we happen to know from the manufacturer that one of the components of this tablet is titanium dioxide or TiO2. And what we could figure out was that this is simply a matter of the mixing of the material or clumping together during the manufacturing process. It didn't seem to be an external contamination problem, but rather a processing problem that they had. And this is a problem for them, not just because it looked unsightly, but titanium on the surface is a reflective material. And so the lack of it on certain areas of the surface could lead to light degradation for the product. And so it was ultimately recalled. The next study is another very common thing, which is beverages in a clear bottle. This was a liquor problem, but it's very easy to see a foreign particle that's floating around inside a bottle. And so we get a lot of these kinds of problems. This particular one looked kind of amorphous. It was relatively large and kind of floating around as a blob. We isolated it, took a look by light microscopy, but it didn't look very interesting that way. It didn't have enough detail in the light image to determine anything. You put it under the electron microscope, and that's the image you see in the middle. And it has this very distinct structure to it. That made it very interesting and gave us some ideas about what might be going on because of that structure. We did an IR on it. The IR analysis allowed us to see that it was composed of both cellulosic and protein components. And that combination of cellulose and protein tells us that what you've got is a microbial source. And so that this was clearly a biofilm related material. The client can then sanitize their lines properly, put in a final filtering before their bottling operation. Problem went away and hasn't been an issue since. So being able to do both this combination of techniques allows us to prevent getting pulled into the wrong diagnosis of the problem. And for the last few studies, I'll pass the baton back to Dave.
Okay, thanks, Neil, for that. We are coming up on time, so I'm going to go through the final case studies pretty quickly. This was insects in a bulk non-dairy creamer. Bulk super sacks of raw material coming from overseas, going to a co-packer in the United States. During quality control inspection, they're finding insects, artifacts in the product. They're trying to determine, did it come from the co-packer's process? Was there maybe some intermediate step of warehousing, or did it come from overseas? Again, Eurofins scientists came to the facility, independently inspected, sampled, collected samples from the bulk super sacks with intermediate in the product, finished product, their testing, and optical microscopy of the insects, isolated different pupa artifacts, and then we had insect identifications by our expert entomologist. It determined it was a local insect, and it wasn't any of the super sacks. So it was a problem at the co-packer and a favorable outcome for the client. This case study 7, here's was a combustion byproducts, dietary supplement factory, plant shut down. What was the source of the fire? Was there a fire? Was it maybe just something overheated? Was it a gasket? This or that, a problem with the HVAC system. So again, we were able to collect samples, perform both optical microscopy, SEM-EDS for level 2 to 3 combustion byproducts, able to determine what type of soot, ash, char was not present, isolate it to a certain instrument or a certain device in one of the lines that had a problem and then accidentally vented into some of the ventilation systems. They were able to get that corrected, get the plant cleaned up and running in a matter of days as opposed to weeks. Case study 8 was a different factory that had microbial contamination ID or problems, and they wanted to know, gee, was it in the water? Was it in the raw materials? Was it cleaning sanitation? Was it, human beings, spit or bodily fluids that somehow were, getting into things or other source of contamination? So we did an array of swabbing on their raw materials, intermediates, finished products throughout the process. Did culturing, speciation, and really we found out that it was a combination of processed water that they thought was cleaner than it really was, but it wasn't, and then just some kind of sloppy, I'll say, lack of better, housekeeping and sanitation, both in terms of HVAC, cleaning between different product runs, and they were able to get a 10-fold reduction in out-of-spec production kind of after the work we did with them. And finally, case study 9, everyone likes this one, it's the final one. Off taste and Jello shots, because no good scientist wants to have a bad tasting Jello shot. So it was kind of, they looked at all the ingredients and things going into the Jello, and that wasn't it, because I mean it's alcohol, it's sugar, and it's Jello mix, right? Hot water. That wasn't it. And this change, the problem only occurred when they automated their process line, and of course it's when they're ramping up and their sales are through the roof, right? So we got involved and we looked a little further and said, well, let's look at your packaging, let's look at your process, let's look at other steps. And what we found is, in the course of their scale up their automation, they eliminated a slip sheet that used to be on the foil lids that were cut and adhered on top. Well, the ink on the top of the foil was now touching the kind of epoxy coated bottom side that was leaned here. So I'm gonna plug in. Hopefully I got a low battery warning. Sorry, guys. And so what we found is, excuse me, that caprolactam was a contaminant. We're like, well, what's caprolactam in? Turns out it was in the ink on the top side of the label. So just the simple step of automating, and someone decided to save a few bucks by eliminating a slip sheet between layers of the labels that was adhered to the top of the Jello shot, was allowing. So now you have, ethanol that's in the Jello shot. Is a wonderful at extracting caprolactam that was basically being transmitted from the top side labels to the bottom and into it. So the slip sheet was put in, and Jello shot production was saved. All right, so sorry for the technical difficulties there. With that, really 3 summaries and conclusions, and we're at time. And that is, there's a wide portfolio of techniques for isolation, identification, foreign materials, unknown objects, and you really need to look broader and really look at your product packaging, your manufacturing processes. Next, proactive inspection, testing, and risk mitigation can reduce risk and should help your brand, your reputation, your bottom line. And there's many factors to consider if you're engaging a third-party lab for this kind of investigation. So with that, for anyone who can stick around, we'll be more than happy to field questions. And for that, Caitlin, I'll let you take over, and our panel will answer questions for anyone who can stick around.
All right, thank you, Dave. Well, thank you everyone for attending the presentation today. I do realize we are running a little bit short on time here, so if you have to get going, that's fine. You can still pop your question into the chat, and we will have a Eurofins representative follow up with you. But our first question here is, what industry guidance is there for foreign material size in food and beverage?
Dale, do you want to take that, or you want me to take that one? So I'll go ahead and take that one, folks. So there's a variety of industry guidance, whether it's from USDA, FDA. It's more rigorous for pharmaceutical or infant formula products, but kind of in general, particles in the range of 2 to 7 millimeters. That's kind of what catches people's attention. But there can be instances where particles as far as 0.1 millimeter can cause a problem, or could be subject to regulatory concern, depending on what it is. So there isn't a one size fits all.
All right, thank you, Dave. Our second question here is there a size limit on foreign materials objects that Eurofins can detect using the techniques outlined in today's webinar?
Now, actually the fun part is we've run samples as small as what we estimate the weight to be 10 picograms. This is almost inconceivably small. We're talking about something that requires a fairly high power microscope to even see them. And we can still get high quality analysis on something that's microns in size. So if you can see it, we can identify it. That's almost never a problem.
All right, thank you, Neil. Our third question here is, what is the correct procedure to follow if a foreign object is found in a food item?
Oh, that's a great question. So I'll take that. Basically, do not disturb the item. Take a photograph of it. Keep in the original packaging. Try to close packaging or overpack it in a, like a clean, like Ziploc style bag. Aluminum foil is pretty good. If it's refrigerated, put it back in the refrigerator. If it's frozen, put it back in the freezer. And then typically on any product, there's going to be a consumer hotline, a 1-800 number you can call. You want to write down the product name, where you purchased it. If you have a store receipt for that, there's probably going to be some type of a lot code that someone on the hotline will ask you to. And then, from there, in many cases, it's going to say, hey, destroy it, we'll send you a new one, or we'll give you, refund on your product. But you don't want to tamper it or alter it, because that can really contaminate the evidence.
All right, thank you, Dave. We have time for about 2 more questions here, and then I'll wrap it up. But our fourth question here is, what is the detection limit of X-ray inspection systems used by major food producers?
They actually have a pretty wide variety depending on how old their system is. Typically, they can see 1/10 of a millimeter and up if they're properly correlated. It's a relatively modern machine. But older packing lines might not see anything smaller than a millimeter or something, sometimes even larger. But the best systems can pick up metallic particles that are 1/10 millimeter. The problem is things like aluminum are not metallic, and so a lot of flakes that are of concern can still get through those kind of detection systems. So visual inspection ultimately ends up being very important, regardless of the metal detecting equipment that's being used.
All right, thank you, Neil. Our fifth and final question here is, what are the most common sources of foreign materials in foods? Excuse me.
Wow, it's a great question, and I think the answer would differ depending on every chemist you ask that to. We see so many different sources, everything from corrosion of equipment, improper cleaning of equipment. We see insect infestations. We get herbs and spices that the standards for them are so high, with amounts of sand that's acceptable or traditional. You'd be amazed at how much garbage is in your normal food supply and is sometimes considered acceptable. So we see all kinds of stuff. And the question simply becomes, what's of concern? We get a lot of work from beverage manufacturers with foreign materials floating around in the beverage. And a very high percentage of them, as Val mentioned earlier, are actually backwash. Somebody takes a medicine, chugs some water, puts the bottle down on the counter, comes back an hour later, looks at the bottle, and they see something floating around in the bottle, and they panic. Oh my God, I just drank from this bottle, and there's some kind of contaminant in there, some pill or something. We analyze it, find out what the medication is that was in there. It turns out that was the medication they were taking that day. And this has happened just hundreds of times over the last several years. So what's the most common? Everything is common. You'd be astounded at the things we find as contaminants in food products. Everything from salamanders to drugs to minerals, just amazing things.
All right, thank you, Neil. That's going to wrap up our Q&A session today. If we did not get to your question today, we're going to have someone follow up with you to answer that for you. I want to thank everyone for attending today's webinar. A recording of this webinar, along with a copy of the slides, will be available to you in about 3 business days. Thank you again for your expertise and your presentation today, Dave, Neil, and Val. Yeah, thanks everyone for attending. Have a great rest of your day.
Bye-bye.